All right. So today's webinar will focus on the prevention of child sexual abuse. The webinar will review how to respond to and prevent child sexual abuse, how children and families are groomed by predators, and how molesters use needs and vulnerabilities of children and their adults to gain access. You will also learn why children don't tell about being sexually abused and how to respond if they do disclose. We have two presenters for you today. We have Pam Karalunas. She's the chapter coordinator for the Alaska Children's Alliance, and we also have Joanna McFarlin. She's the director of the Kodiak Child Advocacy Center. So just want to say welcome to Pam and Joanna, and the show is yours.
All right, thank you. And this is Pam, and as he said, we're here to talk about preventing child sexual abuse. And I have to move it. Sorry, we are webinar newbies. So, there we go. So, as he said, I am Pam Karalunas with the Alaska Children's Alliance.
And I'm Joanna McFarlin with Kodiak Child Advocacy Center.
And thank you to everyone for being here today. So, I know that sexual abuse we have a very high rate of sexual abuse in Alaska, and I know that sometimes it feels overwhelming. And so today we want to talk a little bit about what you can do and how you can help. Beginning with, it's important to understand how, first of all, that child molesters do manipulate children and the adults around them, and even the entire community, and how they do that. We want to talk about the subtle messages that you send every day when you are talking around children and how those messages are used by child molesters. We are going to talk about why children don't tell, which is far more often the case than children who do tell. Nothing happened is the easiest lie for kids to say when they are being sexually abused. We're going to talk about ways to teach children about safety and how to respond if a child talks to you about being touched. There are stages of grooming or manipulation. Grooming is kind of a nice word for what happens when perpetrators target a child. And those stages are victim selection, establishing access to the victim, developing rapport and trust, and the systemic disinhibition and desensitization that happens. So victim selection is usually based on the personal appeal to that specific offender. It's also important to realize that if the victim that sort of fits the preference is not available, then those offenders turn to other victims, other child victims. So offenders often have a preference for an age or a gender or specific physical characteristics, whether that's attractiveness, the way the child dresses, their stature, whether they're large or small, or any other kind of thing that appeals to that particular offender. But they also have to select the families in order to be able to get by with what they do. And there are certain vulnerabilities that really make a child and their family easier victims. One is economic hardship. One is if it's a single parent or caregiver, absent or uninvolved parents, lack of supervision, lack of boundaries, lack of parental assertiveness, if there are emotional or mental health issues in the family, if there's substance abuse, or if there's a history of family violence. So those were the family vulnerabilities. The child vulnerabilities are pretty much as you would expect: poor self-esteem, developmental differences, low self-confidence, emotional neediness, that desire to excel and please adults, and the lack of a good support system, whether that's adults or friends or whoever that might be. More child vulnerabilities. Perpetrators have to figure this out, and they gather the information about those vulnerabilities through communicating with the child, through interaction with the child, and through observation of the child with others. And of course, they have to have access to the children. And there are a number of ways. We've all read about the coaches that molest kids. We've read about the teachers that molest kids. We've read about the priests that have molested kids. People in positions of authority and trust. Not just that the child believes in and trusts, but just as importantly, if not more important, is that the adults in that child's life believe in and trust. So the next step is developing rapport. How do they do that? Well, it's critical that they do that, obviously. And so they address those needs and vulnerabilities of the child through engaging them emotionally, through giving them special treatment, through whether those are gifts, anything from, a trip to McDonald's to an iPad to you name it, whatever is going to work for that specific child and fall within the capabilities financially of that particular perpetrator. Another way is sort of that forbidden fruit. Well, I know you're not supposed to play this game, but if you let me do this, then we'll play this game. So it's that kind of forbidden fruit. And then the triangulation with the adults and the caregivers. Whether or not it's an in-home situation where the perpetrator is turning the child and the other caregiver against each other or setting them up, that's always a critical piece in that developing rapport and trust.
And the forbidden fruit one, too, they will often have kids do, I know we're going to be talking about this in the next slide, but offering them pot or alcohol or something like that, in which kids feel like, oh, I've done something wrong. So it provides two different purposes to, engage the child in something that's sort of the forbidden fruit, but also makes them feel like they've done something wrong so that they don't want to tell. But we'll get to that.
Exactly. Thanks, Joanna. That's a really good point. So that's manipulation from two different perspectives. It's another way that is very common, I've seen over and over again over the 30 plus years I've been doing this work in Alaska, is that they provide an emotional support system to the caregiver, not just to the child, so that that's a way to gain respect and support and trust. So they also try and give that child and or the caregiver the attention that they're needing, the recognition that they're needing, the affection, the romance. It amazed me how often when I worked with a caregiver, they would say things like, but he was so romantic to me, when the caregiver was a mom. And then there's the flat out intimidation and threats. And Joanna talked a little bit about the gifts. And sometimes it's gifts, sometimes it's bringing the family food when they don't have enough food. And then there's the relaxing of the rules. It's a pretty, as you can tell, it's a very broad spectrum of behaviors. And that desensitization that we talked about, that's a gradual process. It includes suggestive conversations, that increasing of physical contact. Perpetrators will say that, they started when they first, had the child sit on their lap or something and the child was uncomfortable. They backed off for a while. There's verbal and nonverbal behaviors. There's that special treatment we talked about earlier. There's games. There are certainly games that can desensitize a child. And then the exposure to pornography, which is a very common one.
And I want to add too that across the board for alleged perpetrators, they will use tickling and wrestling as a it's something that they all do, and it's a form of desensitization. So people can tickle kids in front of everyone. They can even tickle their private parts in front of everyone, and people are okay with that. So if you see people that are tickling and wrestling with kids, it should raise a red flag, and you need to be paying attention to those people, male or female. Who are those people that are tickling kids? I mean, tickling is a pretty intimate thing that you do with your own children, really, but you're not necessarily tickling or wrestling with other people's children. And that should be noted when you're looking around at behavior of other people.
We're going to have a few slides that actually are lessons learned from perpetrators. Sometimes people get the misunderstanding that child sexual abuse is an assault. Frankly, it very rarely is an assault. It's much more sort of kind and gentle and manipulative. That's one thing we hear from child victims often is, well, it felt kind of good. I mean, they're embarrassed about that, but our bodies are sexual. And so they think hard and they determine their strategies with each child victim. It depends on what kind of success they've had with those strategies with past victims, and perpetrators, by the time they get caught, always have past victims if they're adults. It depends on their relationship with a child, and it depends on the developmental stage and specific needs of that particular child.
And you can, I've heard from kids too that it feels like all of us have been in love at one time, and you have that newness of the relationship feeling. And that's often what perpetrators do with kids, is they make them feel so special and you really understand me. You really get me. I don't know, most people don't understand me, but you do. We have such a special relationship. I feel like I can tell you everything. And so they make the child feel so important and special, and it's very confusing, because there are parts of it that feel really good to the child. And that's why it's so hard for them to know what's happening. It's hard for the grown-ups to know what's happening.
So these are tactics used by offenders, and these are from offenders. These are not just ones that we've seen in the work that we've done, but these are actually words from offenders. And as you can see, it all has to do with gaining the trust and authority from the caregivers and from the child. And I think it is really interesting that they often talk about that they took their time. They didn't just, hop in. Not that this doesn't happen, because it does, but they didn't just hop in and start molesting a child. They took their time to build up that trust, and they modeled that trust by just saying, oh, well, you should trust them, or, well, you should trust me. Look at everything I've done for you. So they model that kind of indiscriminate trust. It's interesting that particularly offenders who offend against boys sort of catalog them for future offending. It's like, okay, this child is the most vulnerable right now, so I'm going to go after him. And then, but this child is probably not too far behind, so that'll be next. And one thing that we often hear from people is, well, it couldn't have happened because I was in the room. Well, offenders tell us it can happen. In fact, that's in some cases almost a badge of honor, in that, while I was able to do it right there while people were sitting in the same room. More information from offenders. We've kind of talked about this, that sort of emotional and actual bribery with gifts and money and illegal things, spending time doing things with a child that they really like to do, especially when they're going after adolescents acting like the same age as that adolescent, talking about sex and getting kids to share their own worries or concerns or experiences. And sadly, sometimes they use their own children as bait, as in, Susie likes this when I do it to her. Or sometimes they will get the child to kind of almost recruit their friends to involve them in the process. How do these offenders manipulate adults? We've talked a little bit about this, but again, these are very specific words from sex offenders, known child molesters. And I think it is interesting. Frankly, I never worked with a case where, and I worked with over 800, where the caregivers didn't say, but he always used to say he hated child molesters. And they verbalize that a lot. And frankly, I also did a little work with child molesters. I think that's true because there is sort of a self-loathing of that, what they're doing when they're doing it. So I think they can say that and be perceived as very honest about that, but that's also a very good way of manipulating people.
And they often don't think of themselves as molesting kids. They're teaching them about love. They're showing them how to have a loving relationship, and so they don't see themselves as a child molester, and they don't categorize themselves that way often.
Right. Yes, that happens. So what can you do? Well, in the words of a child molester, if someone is paying more attention to your kid than you are, be concerned. So we didn't want to bore you with a lot of research, but we did want to throw in a couple of slides with some research, because I know personally I like a little bit of research to back up what I'm feeling or what my experience has been. And I think this is really important. I won't read it to you because I expect most of you can do that. I do think it is important to understand that 66% of the child molesters in this particular study done in 2015 knew their first victim for a year or more. And I think it's important to realize that 2/3 of the incidents occurred while another person was in the same house or even the same room. So what can you do? Well, first of all, it is so common, and Joanna's going to talk about this in a minute, but that one of the reasons kids don't tell is because of things they've heard the adults say that they would normally tell. And when you are talking about things that you hear in the news or experiences that you've had or someone being accused, kids hear that and they apply it to themselves. And so if you are saying, blaming things, shaming things about the victims, whether it's an adult or a child, kids internalize that and think that that's the kind of reaction that they will get from you if you were to find out what was happening to them. So always remember what you're saying within earshot, which doesn't mean in the same room, because as any parent knows, kids can hear. It's almost like they have magic hearing. So that's one really, really important thing. And again, from a child molester, if a child tells you that this is from a child molester, if a child tells you I did something, believe it. Children don't make this stuff up. They lie to get out of trouble, not into trouble. They probably have told you only the tip of the iceberg. Again, this is from a child molester named Joe, and that exactly mirrors my experience and Joanna's experience.
Okay, so do kids lie about being abused? We get asked this a lot, and And I think that, everybody has an opinion about that. But they do. They often minimize the abuse happened at all. Even when they have sexually transmitted diseases or pregnancies, they say, nothing happened. And we've gone over some of the reasons why kids don't tell, and we'll talk more about that. But the statistics are that and some of you watching this may know that some people never tell that they're abused ever. They die and they never tell. And what we know is that kids delay in telling. They tell when they feel safe. So that means sometimes that the perpetrator's moved, or they're moved, or parents got a divorce, or something happened. They went to camp. They feel safe. And so often it's very difficult to prosecute these cases because kids don't tell. And then when they do tell, there's been quite a while that's gone by, and it's hard to go back and prove that. But kids don't tell. They often, sometimes they're told by the alleged perpetrator that they won't be believed, that they're going to get in trouble because, like we talked about before, if they've smoked pot, or they've drank a beer, or they were somewhere they weren't supposed to, they feel complicit in what happened, and so they don't want to tell. And also, I hear a lot that I've heard kids tell me that they felt like their mom was going to be depressed. They were going to upset the family. And, oftentimes kids don't tell because they love their parents and they know that it's going to implode the family, and so they don't want to tell. And, I have parents that tell me, oh, my daughter would tell me, my son would tell me, we have such a good relationship. And that's just the reason why they don't tell, because they don't want to hurt their parent. And often I hear kids tell me that they were afraid that they were going to be put in a foster home, that they'd be taken away. They feel that they'll be blamed. And again, like what Pam was saying, that what we say, what they hear us say in relation to other people that come forward, they don't want to be blamed. They don't want to be in the limelight. They don't want to destroy their family. They don't want to be blamed. And they've heard, people being called horrible names who have come forward, and so they don't want to be in that position. And the other thing to reporting abuse, I think that we all have this idea of how kids are going to act when they disclose. We feel like they should be, or we see on TV that they should be histrionic and cry and sob. And that's just not the case. I mean, it can happen that kids cry when they tell, but most of the time they are very matter of fact, or little kids accidentally tell. But it's not, I think this goes to our believing them, and that kids tell, and sometimes we think that they should be acting a certain way and should be emotionally, visibly emotionally upset. And oftentimes that's just not what we see.
I had one kid very patiently explained it to the adults around her that, so you just found out about this. I've known about it for 6 years.
Yeah, good point. I think, we all have kids that we're around, and even our own children. And oftentimes we hear some of these quotes that I have here a lot. I don't like her. He's mean. And we don't ask the next question, which could be, tell me about that, because we make assumptions about what kids are thinking and feeling, and we don't ask. And I think sometimes we're fearful of it, but other times our minds just are not going in that direction. And so I had a little girl who told me, I don't like the greenhouse. And I said, tell me about the greenhouse. And she said, well, the people in it are mean. And I said, tell me about the people in it that are mean. She said, they hit the kids. And she was describing her foster mom who had been hitting the kids that were there. And so had I not asked those questions, I wouldn't know that. But oftentimes kids try to tell us in their own way, but we're really not asking good questions, or we're really not listening. So if you do have a child that discloses abuse to you, here are the steps for addressing that. And I know it can be really scary for people, but they've obviously entrusted you with this So you're in a good position, but just stay calm, to listen, and to tell them you believe them, even if you don't, because there may be things that they're saying that you're thinking in your mind that couldn't have happened. I don't know. We weren't there. She's confused or he's confused. No matter, it's normal to have all of those questions in your mind, but you can put those aside and just tell them, I believe you, and I'm so glad you told me. So reassure them that it wasn't their fault. Let them know you're going to get them help if they're at an appropriate age, because if they're really young, you don't need to do that. But if they're an older child, you need to let them know what you're doing, because you need to tell them the truth. And often they've been lied to a lot, so you don't want to not tell them that. You just tell them, I need to get help. And I had one child that told me, I hate you and I'm never going to talk to you again. And I was providing counseling services at the time. And I told him, I totally understand that. And I understand that, but you're way too important for me to not, tell someone about that. And so he understood, and obviously he talked to me again, but sometimes they can be really upset. You don't want to question the child anymore. You don't want to dig for details, because that might mess something up in the investigation. You just want to listen, and if they're a volcano of information, you don't want to shut them down. You want to listen to them, but don't investigate. And you don't want to take things into your own hands and confront the offender. And I know that that's particularly, it's hard to not do if it's in your own family or they're good friends, but you don't know the unintended consequences that could happen.
One of my favorite interviews that I've ever watched was a little 8-year-old girl who was just going into great detail about what happened to her, which was really good. That way she could get help. But she said that she had told her parents after a while. She didn't tell them right away for all the reasons that Joanna has discussed. But and the interviewer asked her, and then what happened when you told her parents? And she said, and they said, how brave were you? And it was so, it just made such a huge difference for that little girl.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about prevention education and how to talk to your own child. And I'm going to caveat that with, the lion's share of keeping children safe is with the adults around them. And because a child in the presence of a sexual predator, it's not a fair fight. They stand no chance. There's research around these things that I'm telling you about are going to be helpful, but the lion's share of the protection is going to come from the adults around them, and being cautious of the people that are spending one-on-one time with your children. But abuse prevention is not about sex education. It's about, prevention and body ownership. We want kids to be smart. We don't want them to be scared. And I think that the worries are more on the part of the caregivers and not so much on the kids. But what I like about what I'm going to teach you is that it has to do with people, no matter who they are, breaking the child's safety rules. It's not about who the person is. It's about the behavior, simply the behavior. And if kids understand that it's not about, it's okay for daddy to do that or mommy to do that. It's not okay for anyone to do that. And that they can, they have some trusted adults to tell. So that's good. And this is what I'm going to teach you is through Gunderson National Child Protection Training Center. And I really like what they do, because their work is, they spend a lot of time training all of the professionals who are invested in bringing this problem or addressing this problem. Prosecutors, the forensic interviewers, the medical providers, the advocates, and the child welfare workers. And so it comes from a perspective of what is the actual problem and how do we actually address it? Because in the past, we've had a lot of work around stranger danger, and that's what I was taught when I was going to school. But, it's just, that's not what we see. There's a small portion of people that sexually abuse kids that are strangers. Most of the time, as you saw in the other slides, that it's people that the child knows and trusts and that are in their, circle of trust. And so these are the safety rules that we're going to go over, and how you can work with your own children and the children that you know, to make sure that they can do that. Okay, so the first thing is to teach children their proper, body part names, and that's really important. And when we interview kids, we see how this goes awry. We have kids that, they have a butt in the front and they have a butt in the back, and it's really, really difficult for kids to explain what happened. And so it's if they know their proper body part names, it gives them a language, a proper language to have to understand their body, and then to tell what happened. And it reduces their confusion about it. It reduces the ability of the perpetrator to confuse them. I'm touching your tummy when it's their their vagina. Then the child is going to be less confused. And it also reduces the confusion for telling, because people are going to know what they're actually saying. This is a really big one. It's really important to teach your child their gut or uh-oh feeling. And the way I explain it to kids is that we have kind of a superpower, which is our gut instinct, and everybody does. It's almost like the Spider-Man tingly sense that they have when something is wrong, and everybody has it. And there are people that are not alive that talk themselves out of listening to their uh-oh or gut feeling. And I think that all kids understand the uh-oh feeling. I even talk about that with older kids, even though I tell them, I know this is kind of dumb, but it's sort of that gut or uh-oh feeling when you're around someone who you feel uncomfortable with, or you're in a situation that you don't feel comfortable with, to listen to your gut feeling. And frankly, your gut feeling may be working better than someone else's. So if someone else doesn't have an uh-oh feeling, that doesn't mean that there's nothing wrong. You really need to listen to your uh-oh feeling, no matter who it is or what's happening. The other thing is that there are no secrets. Secrets are not okay. There's a difference between secrets and surprises. Surprises are more like birthday party. We're not going to tell mom that we're having a surprise birthday party. That's a surprise. It's something that doesn't hurt someone. It's not a secret that is, it's a surprise, which is different than a secret. Secrets are more negative. They're, usually something that make people not feel good, in an emotional way. So teach the difference with kids and give, firm examples of what those differences are. And if anyone asks your child to keep a secret from you, that's a red flag. Okay, talk about touches. So, I think that a lot of times people don't want to teach about touches because they're worried that, kids are going to be scared, and that, but you can talk to kids that most people are good and kind, and, but there are some people who have touching problems, and you can't tell who those people are by, if they're a man or a woman or a kid or a grown up, or, tall or short or skinny or fat or anything else, that, you can't tell what's in people's brains, but some people have touching problems, and that, your private parts are the parts of your body that are covered up by your swimming suit. And to tell someone of your 5 trusted adults, if someone wants to touch or look at your private parts, or, they want you to touch or look at their private parts. All right. And then the other part is that there are times when someone may want to, may need to touch a child's private parts to keep them clean or healthy, like changing a diaper and going to the doctor. But it's always good to tell kids, we're going to the doctor. They're probably going to look at your private parts, and that's okay. I'm going to be there with you, so that there's some dialogue ahead of time about that, because there are, physicians that sexually abuse kids too, and so they still have to tell if they have that uh-oh feeling, and so. But clean and healthy touches are never a secret. That's the other thing, is that if touching should never be a secret, and that if someone does trick you into a touch that's confusing or scary, that it's not your fault, and to tell one of your 5 trusted adults. And then the other thing to tell about is that to tell if someone's getting hurt, and you can have a discussion about the difference between tattling and telling. Tattling is saying something to get somebody into trouble, and telling is saying something to get somebody out of trouble. And I think that's a really good description. And then to, plan ahead with your child, who are the 5 trusted adults in their life that they can tell, and plan ahead. So dare to be the one, and to stand up for kids. And I always like to tell people to not underestimate their ability to help a child. And we all have kids in our families, in our communities, in our neighborhoods that we know, and it's our job to look out for them and to speak up if there's something that we see that's not okay, or we see adults who have worrisome behaviors. And so keep up the good work, and be looking out for those kids that are in your surroundings. And so we'll open it up for questions. If anybody has questions, we'd be happy to answer that. I see one here. What if the sex offender is an older sibling and the victim was a younger sibling? How do the parents handle this situation?
That is something that we are actually seeing more and more of, and that's where it's really good to work with preferably somebody at your local Child Advocacy Center who can give you information and support. It's really critical to give both the child with the acting out behavior and the sibling with who was victimized attention, and that they be in therapy, and that those therapists work together. You should never have just one therapist deciding what's going to happen for both of them. And I know this is easier said than done in some of our really small communities, but the primary focus is to keep the child safe, the younger child safe, which also, frankly, is keeping the older child safe, because you don't want the older child to continue that behavior. That's a really good question, and it's a pretty complicated question, but there is information out there, and there is help available through your local Child Advocacy Center.
And you're welcome to call us directly to get help with that. I would say that it's a problem that you're going to need help with, and there's a lot of questions about why is the older child doing that, and I would say that it would be really good for that child to get some help and even be interviewed. And but please call your local CAC to ask about that, or us directly. I'm looking for other questions.
Do we want to, can we turn it so that people can ask verbally, or just
should be there contacts?
I think we can do this.
So the question about kids acting out on other kids, there are a number of things that have to be taken into consideration to help determine what needs to happen. It used to be that we automatically thought if an older kid was acting out, then something had happened to that child. We now know that that's not true, that that's not always the case. We also know that it must be addressed, though, so that we don't grow into adult perpetrators. We know that sometimes just kids who are being completely unsupervised, who run across pornography, are trying to figure out what all that means and how, they sometimes will act it out. So there are a number of reasons that kids do act out that have nothing to do with being abused. But you also need to find out for sure. So that is not a problem that any family should need to be addressing by themselves. Are there any other questions? That was a really good question. Thank you for asking that. What special suggestions do you have for parents who abuse their children? I'm not quite sure what that what you're referring to. If you're referring to parents who sexually abuse their children, I mean, that's not a behavior that just goes away. That's a behavior that does require some very strong intervention. When you've been doing this work as long as I have and many of us, we see perpetrators over and over and over again because there wasn't appropriate intervention, which almost always includes jail time, and it definitely includes some specialized sex offender therapy. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I would just say, yeah, for sexual abuse in particular, I think they're going to need help of professionals for that. And there are people who have sexual attraction to children who are not offending, and that's a really hard thing. And I think it's a difficult matter to step forward and get assistance with. But the cost is, the health and well-being of children. So the recommendation would be to get professional help and input.
Any other questions? Oh, okay. So Sarah, you asked if in these cases of sibling, will the older child be listed as a sex offender? That depends on a lot of things. It depends on how old the child is. It depends on basically assessing culpability. That's a very common concern that people have, and I understand that concern. That makes a lot of sense. Younger kids do not get listed as sex offenders. We just don't have enough reason to do that. And we are kind of statewide looking at some of those laws around that. It really doesn't always benefit anybody by doing that. In fact, sometimes it's quite harmful. So again, that's one of those things that you really want to look at on a case-by-case basis. And there are definitely people with knowledge who know who to refer to for those kinds of things. There can be some very strong advocacy to keep that from happening. So that's a really good question without a really concrete answer. But thank you for asking it, Sarah.
And Sarah, there's a lot of research that getting kids help when they're younger. The younger they are, the better. But getting help and assistance for that problem really has an improved risk of them not doing it again. So it's really important that you get your child in for help, or the older sibling in for help, and the younger child too, for that matter. But there's a lot of good research about it working, so it's important to get them in. Let's see if there's any other questions. Here's one. How much training, this is from Francis, how much training is happening in rural communities to address child sexual abuse prevention? To prevent child sexual abuse. I think that really varies in the rural communities, but I know that the communities with Child Advocacy Centers do quite a bit of training in the rural communities, and I know in Kodiak that to be true. But maybe Pam has a better answer than that.
I think all of the communities that have a Child Advocacy Center do some training. It kind of depends on the community. Some communities, frankly, aren't ready to hear that child sexual abuse happens. In other communities, they are open and they invite somebody from the Child Advocacy Center to do a presentation. We have a number of rural centers where somebody from the CAC goes to the surrounding villages to do presentations. So how much training, again, it kind of depends on the community. I mean, you can have a training and there will be lots and lots of people attending, or in another community you can have a training and get two. So it kind of depends on the community readiness to hear about child sexual abuse. Good question. Oh, another good question. You want to answer that? Do you want me to?
Alicia, is that right? Alicia, why are more cases of sibling sexual abuse coming out? Is it being more reported, or is it happening more often? That's a really good question, and I don't know that we have the answer to that. Maybe Pam does, but I know that, with the onslaught of pornography being available in every child's pocket computer, I think that has contributed significantly to this problem.
And yeah, you're right. That is an excellent question. It's happening nationwide that there are more and more cases of sibling abuse. I think it's probably a combination of both. I think it is being reported more because I think people realize they need to get their kids help. But I also think that it's that desensitization that we talked about earlier that perpetrators do. When kids get as easy access to pornography as they do, all on their own without any other adult, they're trying to figure it out. So I think it's probably a combination of things. I also think that in many cases we don't have the same sort of supervision as we used to because parents are overwhelmed and trying to make ends meet, and computers just give us such easy access to things. And there are some great websites on monitoring your child's computer use and ways to keep your child safe that I can't remember off the top of my head. But that's a really good question, and that is something that is being researched right now. Another good question and another hard question. The statistics on rehabilitation for offenders. Well, I can tell you that for children who get in and get, their therapy early, it's way high. For adult offenders, that's a little more difficult to measure. And frankly, it kind of depends on who you talk to. One of the ways that they measure it, of course, is with offenders who are in treatment, and they're in treatment because they've been to jail, and most offenders will do pretty much anything to stay out of jail. So that's something that we really don't know the answer to at this point. But what we do know very clearly is if we intervene early when the offender is a young person, whether it's actually offending or whether it's just acting out behavior, we know that is much, much more successful.
And frankly, with adult perpetrators, it's hard to take their word for it. I know that when they screen alleged offenders or offenders, actually convicted offenders, about things, their answers are different before they take a polygraph than after they take a polygraph. And so it's very, very difficult. And of course, the bread and butter with people that sexually abuse kids is manipulation and lying and living a double life. And so it's easy for them to do that. And they're so skilled at manipulating and lying that I think that that's really hard to know. But there is, like we said, research about children getting in and having a lower number of recidivism. So that's encouraging.
Sarah, you're asking good questions. Are there any statistics of follow-up on children who were victim of child sexual abuse? Yes, there are. First of all, we know that lots and lots of kids are sexually abused. We all know the various statistics on that. And just being sexually abused does never, ever, ever make you a sexual abuser automatically. There was some research a while back. There may be some more recent research, but it was like less than 30% of people who were victims as kids end up being perpetrators. What we do know is that once a child has been a victim of sexual abuse by one perpetrator, they are more vulnerable to being a victim again by other perpetrators, additional perpetrators. They are also additionally more vulnerable to being raped as adults or victims in other ways as adults. We're sort of back to that, the impact of childhood trauma on victims. There's a lot of research happening around resiliency. We don't really understand why some kids are resilient with just sort of horrific lives and others are not. The one piece that is really clear, though, is that if there is a strong, supportive adult in that child's life, that increases resiliency. So that's where we would encourage you to dare to be that one strong, supportive adult in the child's life.
Right. You tell them you believe them, you support them, and if they see you being okay, then they're going to do better. So if the caregiver is not doing well, then they're going to have a harder time. And the other thing is with boys, I think particularly parents worry, is my son going to be a sexual abuser if he's been sexually abused? And there's a myth around kids, kind of, they call it the werewolf syndrome, that they're going to hit a certain age and they're going to turn into this sexual predator. And oftentimes men will choose, they were sexually abused as a child and they are determined to, they're not going to do that on purpose. They're making that choice to not do that. And maybe it's not something that they want to do, but in particular, that's something they're not going to do because they were sexually abused. And so I think as parents, we worry sometimes if our children have been sexually abused that that's going to happen. And it's just not, it isn't the trajectory that's going to happen. It's not a given that that's going to happen by any means. Let's see, any other questions? So yeah, the statistics for kids doing well if they've been sexually abused is getting them help and giving them the support that they need and getting the caregiver the support that they need. Again, reach out to your local Child Advocacy Center, and if you don't have one in your community, then calling to the nearest one and talking to them and getting support. There are resources there for children that are victims or children that have sexual behavior problems, and help for you in support if you are dealing with a sexual predator in your life, and how to get help for that as well.
So thank you. Seeing no other questions, thank you very much to those of you who participated and to those of you who listen to this webinar later. And thank you for daring to be the one to be willing to learn about how to help protect kids.
Thank you. Right, okay.